With all the hype surrounding the new Mavic 3 Pro and its triple camera head, we had to ask ourselves, what kind of image sensors did they actually pack inside of that thing? And have we seen these sensors before? As it turns out, 2 of the 3 sensors are nearly identical to that of the original Mavic 3. And that third sensor, the one that you're paying the extra $2,000 to $3,000 for, is coming from a Mini 3 Pro, or at least an almost identical sensor to that of the Mini 3 Pro. So let's go through the different sensors they have on the new Mavic 3 Pro, their uses, and their pros and cons. It's not all bad, but it's not all good either. And ultimately, our goal is to help you make an informed decision before you hand your credit card or entire wallet to DJI for the new Mavic 3 Pro. So let's go over where we've seen these sensors before. 2 of these 3 sensors were actually taken from the original Mavic 3 drone. You have the Micro Four Thirds sensor, which is incredible. That is your wide angle main sensor on the camera. And then you have your 1/2-inch sensor, which is more of an explorer sensor with a 7x telephoto lens. The third sensor is from the Mini 3 Pro, or at least very similar to it, and we'll get to that in a minute. Let's start with a Micro Four Thirds sensor, which is the main reason you would buy the Mavic 3 Pro, or the original Mavic 3 or Mavic 3 Classic for that matter. The Micro Four Thirds sensor is pretty much the same across those 3 drones. They're all 5.1K, essentially the same size, and really the only standout difference is you can get 120 frames per second out of the Mavic 3 Pro. And to be honest, a wide angle lens on a GPS drone rarely needs 120 frames per second. I mean, you might use it occasionally, but for me, it's really not going to justify it as a major upgrade. Slow motion like that is usually reserved for action or zooming in or really close shots like you would get with an FPV drone. And for photos, it's basically the same exact sensor. Yes, there are some other features with the new Mavic 3 Pro that are great, but overall, there's not a huge difference when it comes to its main sensor. So let's move on to the other sensor that was in the original Mavic 3 drone. The other sensor is a 1/2-inch, yes, 1/2-inch sensor, which is what you see on a lot of cell phones and is a lot smaller actually than what's on this phone. That sensor is more of what they would call an explorer sensor or an explorer camera, and it has a 7x telephoto lens. A lot of that telephoto effect is actually the sensor being much, much smaller and essentially cropping in, so they don't really need to zoom that much. It's kind of like a crop in, but for the sake of this video, it's not that important. So there's really not a lot of difference between the telephoto lens on the Mavic 3 Pro versus the original Mavic 3. There is just a touch more zoom on it, but it's barely noticeable at all, and it does actually have a little faster aperture. It's 3.4 instead of 4.4, which does give you a little better low light. And one thing I want to point out is the new Mavic 3 Pro does a better job of mixing the color science and the sharpening together. Whereas the original Mavic 3 Pro, they went through some updates and it slowly improved, but it looks like all that's coming out on release with the new Mavic 3 Pro versus the old Mavic 3, which was pretty clunky when it was first released. But overall, you have a 1/2-inch sensor with a 7x telephoto lens, still 12 megapixels. It can do up to 4K 60 and an f3.4 aperture. So the low light will be a little bit better. Let's get into the Mavic 3 Pro sensor that all the hype's about. See, that third camera is actually a 1/1.3-inch sensor. That is nearly identical to that of the Mini 3 Pro. How identical? It's a 1/1.3, it's 48 megapixels, and it can do 4K 60. So the 48 megapixels, that's great for photos, but 1/1.3 at 48 megapixels, those are gonna be really small pixels, and you're gonna have some issues with low light, more so than the Mini 3 Pro. And before any of you get on the keyboard, the reason I say that is because the Mini 3 Pro has an f1.7 aperture. For example, this is set at f2.8 now, and that is f1.8, which is really close to f1.7. So that gives you a difference of how much more light the Mini 3 Pro lets in, whereas the new Mavic 3 Pro will be closer to f2.8, which is not gonna let as much light in. Now, to be fair, that's on a telephoto lens, and that's where things start to change. The telephoto lens gives you a 70mm equivalent focal length, which will be fantastic for parallax, and again, will be great for photos. But it's not going to quite hold up to that Micro Four Thirds sensor that the Mavic 3 is so well known for. Oh, and it's also not going to have vertical shooting. The gimbal just doesn't work that way. And just to give you a comparison for scale, these 3D printed rectangles are actually the exact size of the sensors on the Mavic 3 Pro. You have the Micro Four Thirds right here, which is your main camera and is the same main camera on the Mavic 3. You have your 1/1.3, which is the new sensor that is also in the Mini 3 Pro. And then you have the original 1/2" sensor that is on the Mavic 3. And just for comparison, this is the Air 2S or Mavic 2 Pro sensor, and this is the iPhone 14 Pro sensor. Both of these are larger than the new third sensor that's been added on the Mavic 3 Pro. Now, I'm not saying that the smaller sensor isn't any good. It's still going to be a really solid sensor, and it will work well for most applications, especially photo. But I'm just trying to point out the fact that in a lot of cases, if you only need a little extra zoom, you might be better off just to crop in on your Mavic 3 Micro Four Thirds sensor than going out and buying another drone for something you might not use that often, and when you do, it might not be high enough quality anyway. I'm not trying to bash on the Mavic 3 Pro here, but I am trying to call out something that may be a gimmick for some of us who have gas because we just want to buy the latest, greatest drone. So in summary, if you're looking at buying the Mavic 3 Pro as your first kind of major drone or professional drone, and you don't have any of the other Mavic 3s, it's a fantastic piece of equipment. And honestly, you probably couldn't do any better for the price. So unless you're making a lot of money with photography, I don't really see a good reason to upgrade from the 3 or the 3 Classic to the 3 Pro. If you're into video, you probably shouldn't upgrade. If you don't own either one, well, then it's a great buy and I'd probably go for it. If you're considering buying or upgrading to the Mavic 3 Pro, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And I'm sure there's a few things in here that you guys may have questions about. I'd love to talk about those too in the comments. And if you guys like this video, I ask you to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.